Okay guys, so it's been about, I'd say, a week and a half now. I was waiting on parts and then we had a holiday in between there, but I've got all my parts laid out here. My balance shafts, as you can see, I've got all that stuff nice and clean now. My lower oil pans all cleaned, all the silicone that was on there, same with the timing cover, all nice and clean. You know, everything with oil passages, I blew air through, make sure everything was clean in the parts washer. My guides, which I said I was reusing, they're nice and clean, same with the chains. And then I have all my new parts here. I have the new balance shaft tensioner. I have the changeover valve for the oil pump. My hydraulic tensioner for the main timing chain. Here is the valve that adjusts the cam timing and the intake camshaft. Of course, the sealant to seal everything together. I made sure that the lower oil pump pickup was clean and clear. Blew air through it, ran it nice and clean. I've got here a new cam bridge. And you can see in here where the screen is actually recessed where it should be. So hopefully that was my issue. Again, I don't really know, which is why I have so many parts here that we're going to replace that are suspect, including a new oil pump. And then, like I said, everything here is all factory Audi parts. I didn't want to risk anything with aftermarket, so we spent the extra money and got factory parts. Now what I have to do too, before I go to put all those new parts on, I have all the internal parts cleaned up, but I'm going to right away go ahead and clean the front of the motor here, get some of this dirt, grime, grease mess off, as well as all the silicone that is here. Somebody had gone and put way too much silicone in places where it doesn't need to be. This is a silicone sealant or a silicone gasket that goes on this plastic cover. It doesn't need extra silicone sealant. Somebody went and put silicone sealant on there. So I'm going to clean all this off and make sure there's none sitting in the motor anywhere. But that's basically my next step. I'm going to clean the lower oil pan surface here. Clean all this stuff up here. With some brake clean, I'm going to try to clean through some of the oil passages, make sure they're all free and clean, and then I'm going to dry everything off with compressed air before we start reassembling this thing. Alright guys, so I've got everything cleaned up all nicely from underneath. My oil pan rail is all nice and clean. I've got the area where the oil pump sits clean. I'm going to give it another wipe before I go putting a new oil pump on. But I did blow compressed air through all the passages to try to get, if any debris is in any of those other passages, out. Again, I don't think any of that has to do with any of my low oil pressure issue. But just as a precaution, I did it anyway. I've got everything on the front of the motor all clean. All the old silicone that was on all of that is all off now. I blew everything with compressed air to make sure I had no silicone debris anywhere. And then with brake clean, cleaned and dried everything up, because this will get a silicone sealant once I'm all done. And again, before I go to install those covers, they're going to get another wipe down to make sure that it is all clean and dry of oil and any grease on there. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reinstall my oil pump, or install my new oil pump with the chain, and then I'll install my balance shafts and then start putting my timing system back. And hopefully when this thing's back together, we have oil pressure. First things first, I'm going to put the oil pump back. So making sure my mating surface here is nice and clean. These are machined surfaces between the upper oil pan and the oil pump. The other thing I want to point out is there is no timing marks at all for the oil pump. It's not necessarily, the chain that goes from here to the crankshaft is just to drive the oil pump. One of the other few things I want to point out is make sure that the alignment centering dowels are not still left in the block from the old oil pump. The new one, at least from the factory, comes with new alignment dowels. And then the last thing I want to point out is the only difference I really saw between this and the old pump is the old pump had a screen that went in this area here. And the way this thing is cast, there's no way to put that screen in here. This area is slightly different. So I don't know if that has to do with the revision. This is quite a few revisions higher than what was originally on here. But I just wanted to point out those few things. So we're going to get this oil pump back into place. Get our bolts in. And then these bolts are going to get torqued down to 20 Newton meters. Alright guys, so now that my block is nice and cleaned where the balance shafts go, I just want to remind you to put the plastic deflector back on the exhaust balance shaft. One thing you have to look out for is the tab that's here on the back is going to go into a notch on the back of the engine block. So it needs to be inserted basically with this in line with the cylinders. So this will go in and all the way to the back. The other thing I want to point out is this is a very tight fit. So you want to put this into something cold for at least 30 minutes or so, just to get the metal to shrink down. And the other thing I want to point out is because I clean these all out, even the new ones, you want to put oil in all these passages. Make sure it's nice and lubricated. I already did this one, but I just want to show you guys the locations. The back here, this is where the bearing on the back rides. And then on the very back, this is where the water pump drive gear goes, but there is a lip seal that seals back here. So just make sure there's a little oil to lubricate that seal. You don't want that going in dry. But now this intake balance shaft can get installed. Goes right in now that it's cooled. And now we can install the exhaust balance shaft. All right, same thing with this one. Make sure you lubricate the oil passages. Make sure there's a lot of oil in there. And the same where it rides on the back bearing there. And then this guy could be installed. Same way, make sure it's cooled off well. And it should slip right into place. Okay, the two bolts that hold the balance shafts in get tightened down to 9 Newton meters or 79 inch-pounds. Okay, next to be installed is the intermediate sprocket. And a couple of things I want to point out about this. If you follow the manual exactly, it'll tell you to replace this entire assembly anytime it's removed. I've never actually replaced these ever. But they talk about a special coating on there that sets the backlash and blah, blah, blah. Again, just telling you in case you want to be that crazy and change it. It also says anytime you remove the balance shafts that they need to be replaced as well. As you know, we removed them just to inspect them to make sure nothing make sure nothing was damaged. But just like everything else, I had it cleaned and completely free of oil. So I lubricated the shaft here again and the bearing that's in that shaft, as well as the O-ring seal that's here on the back. And the way this thing installs is make sure that alignment pin aligns with the dowel hole down here. The one on the side is for the oil feed. So it's usually a good idea to install this guy first. When you install this, I know it's probably going to be hard to see on camera, but on the back angled gear, there are 2 dots. These 2 dots need to line up with the single dot on the balance shaft. So make sure that's lined up when you install it. Alright guys, I figured this would be easier to show you. This is both the intake balance shaft and the intermediate sprocket. And it shows you there the timing marks that you need to line up on there so that everything is timed properly. You can also see fairly well here the timing marks the way they should be on all of the balance shafts and on the crank sprocket. And this bolt's going to get torqued down in a 3-step sequence. The first step is 10 Newton meters. Then what they want you to do is just to make sure that there is no lash in this thing. If there is, back the bolt off and re-torque it down to 10 Newton meters. After you do that, torque it down to 20 Newton meters and then an additional 90 degrees. Okay, next step is to install the balance shaft timing chain. On a factory chain, there are a couple of marks. I don't know exactly why there's so many marks, but the marks that we're concerned with here is the little notch that's in the exhaust balance shaft. On the intake balance shaft, there's a little dot. Again, you want to make sure that the 2 intermediate gear and the balance shaft gear dots are lined up before you do anything, but this dot on the intermediate shaft is the one that we're concerned with, and then the arrow on the crankshaft sprocket. So I'm going to start with my exhaust sprocket here on the balance shaft, line up my intake, and then make sure it all lines up with the crankshaft. So once that's on, now I'm going to loosely install all my guides, and then we'll check the timing one more time before we install the tensioner. Okay, the book doesn't show it exactly, but I like to put blue Loctite on the thread since I cleaned these of all grease and oil. And then we're just going to install the guides loose onto the engine block before we tighten them all down. I like to install the guides first and last the tensioner. Make sure that all your marks are lined up with the balance shafts and the crankshaft. And then we can torque these down and I can install my hydraulic tensioner right there. Okay, all the guide bolts here get torqued down to 20 Newton meters, which is about 15 foot-pounds. Even the larger bolt here is also 20 Newton meters. The tensioner itself, that's going to get torqued down to 85 Newton meters. We're now ready to start the assembly of the main timing system. First things first, we're going to put in our new hydraulic tensioner. Again, I like to put a little blue Loctite on these bolts. Again, Elsa Pro does not show to do that. It's sort of just something I've been doing for years while doing these timing belts, or timing chain systems, I should say. And these bolts get torqued down to 9 Newton meters, which is about 79 inch-pounds. Okay, we're now ready to install our camshaft chain. And again, on a factory chain, there are copper colored links here that are going to line up with the marks on the cam sprockets themselves. And then on the bottom, the mark for the lower part of the chain is actually on the larger sprocket on the crankshaft. Its arrow just points up towards the smaller sprocket. So just make sure that that colored link there lines up with that. On the exhaust camshaft, there's a line in it. Make sure it lines up with the colored link. And then the intake camshaft has a mark right on the cam phaser here that should line up with this too. Now that we have the guide rail installed, the bolts are just run down. In order to get the tensioner guide rail installed, I need to be able to remove my sprocket locking tool here. This is where it recommends another technician because you basically need 3 hands here. I need to hold this up while trying to get this bolt in and removing this while holding the camshaft into place. So I think what I'm going to do is just take this out of place for now so I don't drop it. And then I'm going to remove my locking tool here. So that I can now get this guide rail up. Right now I'm holding tension on that chain. I'm going to get the bolt started here. Again, I blew Loctite on this bolt. All right, now both my tools loosened. Now's a good time to verify your timing marks. I got my line here with my copper link there, my intake camshaft with my link up there, and then I have my link down here with the timing mark on there. So I know everything is timed, my chain is tight here, and my tensioner is, well, my guide tensioner is against the tensioner. Okay guys, real quick, I just wanted to give you an up-close look at all these timing marks. So again, on the intake camshaft there, you can see the mark on the sprocket with my chain. Exhaust, there's the mark there on the chain. And then if you go down here by the crankshaft, there's the arrow. And this link here is a colored link, but since I am reusing it, it's sort of lost some of its color. But you'll have to take my word for it, that is the colored link. I just put a little extra color on it so I can easily see it. It's also easy now, you can see the marks on the balance shaft where it lines up on the crankshaft there, as well as the balance shaft here, and then the mark there on the intermediate shaft. It's a little hard to see the marks now that are behind here that line up the balance shaft with that, but that's basically it. All right, so the next thing I need to do here is I need to torque down the bolts on my guide rail and my tensioner rail, and those are getting torqued down to 20 Newton meters. After I get those done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my locking tools here and my wrench, and then I'm going to install the new cam bridge. I'm going to make sure I lubricate the ends of the camshafts very well and make sure the surface where the cam bridge sits against is nice and clean. I want to make sure there's no debris or anything there. Then the cam bridge can be installed. Finally, I can pull my grenade pin here on my hydraulic tensioner, give it one more sanity check, make sure all the timing is correct, and then I could start installing all my covers. When it comes time to install the lower covers here, I'm going to go over a few things with you guys to show you exactly how much sealant you should put on there. Same goes for the oil pan. Okay, my rails are torqued to spec. I'm now ready to install my cam bridge. I've cleaned the mating surface there. I want to now put some oil on the ends of the camshafts and where they go to the thrust on it. This is all going to help to get this installed much easier. This is a very tight fit. Here is my new cam bridge. You can see with the screen in there. And if you put this side by side from the one I removed, you could see how much deeper that screen is now recessed. It's holding that check valve way further into the bore. So again, I'm going to put a little bit of oil on here as well. Rub that around. And I'll put a little bit here on the alignment pin that goes into the guide itself. You don't need to put oil anywhere else. So when you install this though, you need to try to put this on as straight as possible. Otherwise it will bind up. If it does bind, you need to work it off there. And just make sure this thing goes in nice and even. You should not have to bang on anything to get this thing installed. Sometimes it just takes a little patience to get this thing to line up. There we go. So there's my cam bridge. I can now go ahead and install all my Torx bolts there. And then we'll install the thrust bolt here that goes on the exhaust camshaft. Followed by the adjuster bolt that goes on the intake. Okay, first things first. The bolt that's going to go into my exhaust camshaft, again, a little Loctite. All these bolts here we're going to run down by hand first. And then there is a certain sequence that these should be tightened down in. It's not like a sequence of tightening down a cylinder head, though I would recommend tightening from the inside out anyway. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to put all these bolts in by hand, and then the smaller bolts here, the T30s, are going to get torqued down to 9 Newton meters. And then the bolt that's in the camshaft itself, there are two variations. There's either an M6 or an M8. Mine happens to be the M8. So this is going to get pre-tensioned to 20 Newton meters and then an additional 90 degrees. If you have the M6 size, it's pre-tensioned to 9 Newton meters and then 90 degrees. So I'm going to torque all these now. Okay, now we can install our cam adjusting valve, and this is a left-handed thread, so just keep that in mind. And then also the special tool to tighten this thing or remove it. And there are two different versions, keep that in mind. I'm going to show you guys real quick. The two different versions look very similar. The only difference is the other version, the pins are directly in line. The other version like this, the pins are offset. So keep that in mind when you're grabbing the tool you need for this. So again, 35 Newton meters for this, and it is a left-handed thread. Okay, then finally, to complete the entire timing chain system, we need to reinstall our oil pump chain drive. Again, blue Loctite on here, and then this bolt gets torqued down to 9 Newton meters. Now this spring does go into a little groove on the upper oil pan, so make sure it is seated in there properly. And then we will torque this bolt down. One thing I like to do here is on this style tensioner, I like to take the snap ring and move it all the way into the furthest mark here, or notch I should say, so that when there is no oil pressure, like say for initial startup, the tensioner can't go back further than that snap ring. Okay guys, a few things I want to go over on the oil pan itself real quick before you install it. Obviously you want to make sure that the gasket surface is clean of any old silicone. The pan is clean. You don't want any oil getting in between the sealant because it will cause a leak. As you can see, I have my pan completely clean, dry. There's no oil in there at all. My surfaces are nice and clean of all the old silicone. Same goes for the engine block itself, or I should say the upper oil pan is all clean of oil and grease. And obviously, you know, there was oil in the motor, so I'm going to get some seepage here. So before I put the pan on, I'm going to make sure I wipe that quick. Make sure it's clean and dry. I should say I'm going to wipe it with brake clean and then get my pan up quick. As for the sealant, this is the sealant that Audi calls for. It is a special silicone sealant. It works really well. It makes a really good bond. I've never seen any leaks from these after using this sealant. The other thing I want to point out is you don't need anything more than a 2 to 3 millimeter bead. I mean, that is very small. It's about an 1/8 inch at most. Basically, you're going to follow around the perimeter and on the inside of the bolts. You don't have to go around the bolts, just towards the inside. You don't want too much excess because you don't want it to end up in the pan. Then the oil pickup's going to pick it up and you're going to end up clogging your oil pump and causing all sorts of issues. The other thing I want to mention is there is actually a torque sequence for tightening this oil pan. I'm going to show you guys the program here, and this is basically the tightening sequence you're going to do. So you can see basically just jumping across from the middle and working your way all the way around the pan. So as you can see here, step 1, 1 through 19, all the way by hand. Step 2, 1 through 19, 8 Newton meters, and then an additional 45-degree turn to tighten those pan bolts. So I just wanted to let you guys know that this is how this is going to go on. Okay guys, before I put on the lower timer cover, I just wanted to show you guys a few things. Depending on the year and the engine model you have, there are 2 different covers. One cover with 15 bolts, which is the one I have, and a cover with 8 bolts. The way you apply the sealant is basically the same. The only difference is the tightening sequence. But just like the oil pan, it gets the same sealant, and it gets no more than a 2 to 3 millimeter bead around the perimeter of the cover, with special attention paid to the corners where they meet the upper oil pan and the block itself. So I just wanted to point that out to you guys. You can see here, same thing, same cover. This one just happens to have 8 bolts instead of the 15. Now, the tightening sequence for the bolt with the cover with the 15 bolts is as shown. So again, rather than me trying to show you guys on the car, it's a lot easier if you look here at the actual manual, and it shows you the bolt numbers and what the torque should be. So if you look here, 1 through 5 installed by hand, step 2, 8 Newton meters, and then the weird thing here, and I'm going to tell you why, is it shows 1, 2, 4, 5, and 7 to 15, an additional 45 degrees. The only reason it says to leave out 3 and 6 is because Audi uses a special tool that goes into these 2 positions to hold the crankshaft in position until you get the damper on. Now, I don't have that tool, and as I showed you guys earlier in the video, I just put the damper bolt in there, and being extra cautious when I take that bolt out to put the damper on, you know, that the keyway in that sprocket does not come off of the crankshaft. You have to be very, very careful of that. But that's why it says to leave out those 2 bolts. If you're doing it similar to what I have, you can torque all these bolts down in the same steps right away. Just in case you have it, Here's the tightening sequence for the cover with the 8 bolts. It's pretty much the same thing, only they're leaving out bolts 1 and 4 for the same reason. So you can see everything's pretty much the same, 8 Newton meters and then a 45-degree additional turn. As you can see, I've got my sealant bead around here with a little extra in the corners. My mating surface is clean. Again, make sure that your tensioners are released. Your timing is good. This is the last time you could see it. So, like I said, I have my damper bolt in. That's what's holding my sprocket to the crankshaft. I'm going to leave that in place while I install my timing cover here. And basically, I'm just going to line it up nice and even. Make sure we get it on the dowels. Then I'm going to run all these bolts down. Not tight, just sort of run them down so they're all even. The upper timing cover, you should replace the 2 gaskets. There's a gasket here that goes against the cam bridge for the cam adjusting solenoid, as well as the gasket that goes around the perimeter of the plastic cover. Again, you do not need to put any kind of silicone sealant on this at all. So this gets installed just like this. And after I run these bolts down by hand, they are going to get torqued to 9 Newton meters. Okay guys, I just wanted to show you how I go ahead and I put the damper on without the tool that comes here and holds everything together so you can get this on. Like I was saying, the damper has this weird sort of key notch in it, and the crankshaft looks just the same way. So even underneath the gear, the crankshaft is sort of shaped like this. Gear's on there like that, and then the damper's on there like that. So when I take this bolt off, I have to be very careful that none of this spins, moves, or anything. If it does, it's not going to be timed properly. So I'm going to take this bolt off, and then I'm going to install this damper into its slot right away and put the bolt in and make sure it's tightened down. The one thing you should keep note, you should put a little oil on the damper where it goes against the seal, because you don't want that seal to be torn and leak. So like I said, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get this bolt off. I don't know if it shows up in camera, but the notch here I need is on that top. So I'm going to try to line this up. You can usually feel it pretty easily that it's in the right notch. And then I'm going to drive that bolt down, and then we'll torque that bolt to spec. But as you can see, I could take this thing on and off, and as long as I don't turn the motor or leave it alone, it should be completely fine. With that being said, again guys, if you want, there is a special tool. Goes within these 2 bolts. It's sort of a bracket that goes across so you can hold that sprocket in place while you put all this stuff on. All right guys, it's another day. As any of you have done a job like this before, you know there's a lot of hours to take the whole front end apart, take everything apart to get to the timing system, and then get it all back together. But I have the whole front end back together. I have coolant in the motor. I have new oil and a new filter in the motor. and I'm going to fire it up for the first time. I still have the oil pressure switch removed, so I have my manual gauge on there so I can see what the oil pressure is from cold to as it gets hot. First thing I've done is I've gone into the scan tool and I made sure I cleared out all the codes that are present. You know, I had a lot of things that were disconnected while I was trying to diagnose the low oil pressure. I will still have a fault for the oil pressure switch because, like I said, it is disconnected and it's not in the oil passage, so it's not going to get any oil pressure. But all those are cleared out and we're ready to fire this thing up. And like I said, we're going to be checking to make sure that the cold oil pressure is within spec. Again, I think off the top of my head, I think it's supposed to be 1.2 bar. So roughly 15 psi, 16 psi, something like that at idle. And then their changeover happens, I think, at like 2300 RPM in that range. And it should be about 2 bar to, I think, 3.6. I'm going to have to look up the spec again. I don't know off the top of my head. Let's fire this thing up and see what our oil pressure is. There's my gauge right now. It's reading a little negative, but don't mind that. It's just not completely zero. You can see it bouncing there. It's fine. So start this thing up. So this thing is ice cold right now. It's reading about 31, 32 psi. And then, like I said, I'm getting a warning on the dash for low oil pressure. Turn it off. Well, right now I got a headlight about 2, but if you waited long enough, you'd see there it is, my low oil pressure warning on the top. But I'm just gonna let this thing idle here till it warms up the catalyst, and then we'll see what the oil pressure comes down to. Like I said, I don't remember exactly what the oil pressure rating should be. Just looking around, you know, I see a lot of people say that it should be 1 bar, 1.2 bar. I've been searching all around the service manual here, and I do not see any sort of pressure reading or specification for it. So like I said, we're just going to let this thing idle here, make sure that our pressure stays high enough, and that we also see the changeover. Okay guys, that's it for today's video. Like I said, I wouldn't take this as a general rule of thumb if you have a low oil pressure issue. These are just the steps that I took to try to figure this out, and obviously on a very severe budget. They didn't want to spend $8,000 for a new engine, so we tried to sort of cheat it a little bit and reuse a lot of the parts. Just keep in mind that you may not solve your issue just by replacing the parts that I saw. If you want to follow these steps, you know, put a mechanical gauge on, take it apart, see what may look damaged or anything. You know, like I got a little lucky, I guess. I saw that one check valve in the cam bridge that was bad. Again, I don't know if that has anything to do with it. I ended up changing a lot of parts, but in the end, my oil pressure is now higher. I do still see the changeover in oil pressure, which is good. And the motor sounds much quieter. And one of the other things I stumbled across, I should probably mention, is Audi has a technical bulletin, not necessarily a technical bulletin, but like a technical advisor article that says that if you have an aftermarket oil filter, it might not depress the plunger in the filter housing, and you can get a low oil pressure from that. So keep that in mind. I think it's just for the 3-liter versions, the V6. Not sure if it's for the 2 liters as well, but you know, just keep that in mind. But that's it, guys. As always, if you have any questions, just drop me a comment below. I'll do my best to try to answer it. And if you can, hit that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, share my videos. It helps me keep going in the garage to make these videos because they are very time consuming. And you know, something like this takes me a lot longer to film it and show you guys what I need to do to get that job done. But I appreciate you guys. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.